The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete parade ground at Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia. Recruits shuffled into formation, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the weathered buildings that had witnessed decades of military training. Among them stood Thomas Mitchell, a 52-year-old man whose presence seemed oddly out of place among the fresh-faced 20-somethings surrounding him. Thomas's graying hair was cropped short, regulation style, but his weathered hands and the deep lines etched around his eyes told stories that his younger counterparts couldn't begin to imagine. As he adjusted his position in formation, the sleeve of his uniform rode up slightly, revealing the edge of a faded tattoo on his forearm, a simple anchor with what appeared to be a trident beneath it, the ink having lost much of its original vibrancy over the years. "Look at Grandpa over there," whispered Recruit Johnson, a cocky 19-year-old from California who'd been making jokes since day one. Probably got that tattoo at some carnival back in the Stone Age. Several recruits nearby snickered quietly, trying to keep their amusement hidden from the drill instructors. Before continuing, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to discover more stories of heroes whose true worth isn't written on their sleeves, but carved into their souls through sacrifice and service. Recruit Stevens, standing directly behind Thomas, leaned forward slightly. "My dad's got one just like that from his Navy days. Probably means he swabbed decks on some supply ship for 4 years." The comment drew more muffled laughter from the group, each recruit feeling emboldened by the pack mentality that often emerges in high-stress training environments. Thomas heard every word but remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he gave no other indication that the comments affected him. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the people throwing insults had no idea what they were talking about. Drill Instructor Petty Officer First Class Martinez approached the formation with his characteristic purposeful stride. His eyes swept across the ranks of recruits, noting every detail, every imperfection in their bearing. When his gaze fell upon Thomas, there was a brief moment of recognition, not personal, but professional. Martinez had served long enough to recognize something in the older man's posture that the recruits couldn't see. "All right, listen up." Martinez's voice cut through the Virginia morning air like a blade. "Today you begin your real training. Some of you think you know what military service means because you watched a few movies or heard some stories. Let me disabuse you of that notion right now." As Martinez continued his speech about the realities of military service, the recruits around Thomas continued their whispered commentary about his appearance, his age, and particularly his faded tattoo. They assumed he was some kind of late-in-life career change, perhaps a desperate attempt to find purpose after failing in civilian life. What they didn't know was that Thomas Mitchell had spent the last 15 years working as a high school janitor in a small town outside Richmond, quietly going about his duties, mopping floors and emptying trash cans. The students barely noticed him, the teachers gave him polite nods, and the administration saw him as just another maintenance worker approaching retirement. His colleagues knew him as a quiet, reliable man who showed up early, stayed late when needed, and never complained about the extra work that came with Friday night football games or weekend events. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that here he was again, surrounded by people who saw only the surface, an aging man trying to reclaim some lost glory, rather than someone answering a call that had never truly left his heart. The weight of his decision to return to service pressed heavily on his shoulders, made heavier by the casual dismissal of those who would soon learn what real service actually meant. As the morning formation concluded and the recruits began to disperse toward their first training stations, the comments about Thomas's tattoo continued to ripple through the group, each retelling making the mockery a little crueler, a little more confident in its assessment of the quiet man who walked among them, carrying secrets they couldn't begin to fathom. The mess hall at Naval Station Norfolk buzzed with the usual cacophony of clattering trays, overlapping conversations, and the occasional bark of a drill instructor maintaining order. Thomas sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating his meal while observing the dynamics playing out around him. The recruits had naturally formed cliques based on shared backgrounds, hometowns, or simply mutual attraction to confidence and bravado. At a table across the room, Recruit Johnson held court with his growing circle of admirers, regaling them with stories of his high school football achievements and his plans to become a Navy SEAL. "My uncle was in the SEALs in the 90s, he boasted, his voice carrying further than he probably intended. "He told me what to expect. It's all about mental toughness and physical conditioning. Something most people don't have." Stevens nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You can tell who has what it takes just by looking at them." His eyes drifted toward Thomas's table. "Like our friend over there with the antique tattoo, probably thinking he can relive his glory days or something." The conversation attracted more attention, and soon nearly a dozen recruits were participating in what had become a daily ritual of speculation about Thomas's background. Martinez, the drill instructor, noticed the gathering but chose not to intervene. Sometimes lessons had to unfold naturally, and he sensed something important was brewing. Recruit Foster, a 22-year-old from Texas who'd served 4 years in the Army before switching to the Navy, tried to inject some perspective. "Maybe we should cut the guy some slack. Could be he's got his reasons for being here." But his voice was quickly drowned out by the others, who seemed to have reached a collective conclusion about Thomas's motivations and capabilities. "I heard from Rodriguez that Mitchell worked as a janitor before this," added Recruit Davis, a supply specialist looking to cross-rate into special operations. "Can you imagine? Going from mopping floors to thinking you can hang with the elite forces." The man's delusional. What they didn't know was that Thomas had been listening to these conversations for weeks, not out of self-pity or anger, but with a growing understanding of how little these young men knew about real military service. During his 15 years as a high school janitor, he developed an almost supernatural ability to move through spaces unnoticed, to hear conversations people thought were private. It was a skill that served him well in his previous life, and apparently in this one too. That afternoon, during physical training on the obstacle course, the mockery took on a more public form. As Thomas approached the rope climb, a challenge that would be difficult for any 52-year-old, Johnson made sure his voice carried to the entire platoon. $20 says the old-timer can't make it halfway up," he announced, drawing chuckles from several recruits. "That faded tattoo isn't going to help him now." Thomas approached the rope with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else. His hands, calloused from years of maintenance work, gripped the coarse fibers as he began his ascent. The technique he used was flawless, not the desperate scrambling of most recruits, but the efficient, energy-conserving method taught to those who needed to climb quickly and silently in operational environments. He reached the top in less than 30 seconds, faster than any recruit had managed that day. The descent was equally controlled, his feet touching the ground with barely a sound. He walked away without acknowledging the surprised silence that had fallen over the group, leaving the recruits to wonder where a janitor had learned to move like that. Drill instructor Martinez made note of the performance, but more importantly, he made note of Thomas's complete lack of ego about it. There was no celebration, no glance toward the shocked faces of his tormentors, no sign that he felt vindicated. Just a man doing what needed to be done, the way it needed to be done, because that's who he was. As the training day concluded, the conversations about Thomas shifted slightly. The easy confidence in their assumptions wavered, replaced by a nagging sense that perhaps they'd misjudged something important. But pride and group dynamics have powerful momentum, and rather than admitting error, the mockery simply evolved, finding new angles of attack while refusing to acknowledge the growing evidence that Thomas Mitchell was far more than he appeared to be. The Virginia Beach training facility stretched for miles along the coast, its specialized courses designed to push potential special operations candidates to their absolute limits. The morning air carried the salt tang of the Atlantic, and the tension that comes when theory meets reality in the most unforgiving ways possible. Commander Sarah Chen stood before the assembled candidates, her presence commanding immediate attention. A veteran of multiple deployments, and one of the few women to successfully complete the most elite training programs in the military, she had a reputation for seeing through facades and identifying real capability regardless of its packaging. "Gentlemen," her voice cut through the coastal breeze, "today begins the real evaluation. Everything you've done up to this point has been preparation. What happens over the next 72 hours will determine whether you have what it takes to serve in our most demanding units." The candidates, now numbering 38 after several weeks of attrition, stood at attention in two neat rows. Thomas remained in his characteristic position, not quite in back, not quite in front, simply present and ready. His faded tattoo was barely visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, but it continued to draw occasional glances and whispered comments from the recruits who still hadn't learned to keep their assumptions to themselves. Johnson, who had emerged as an informal leader among the younger candidates, caught Stephen's attention with a subtle nod toward Thomas. "Watch this," he murmured under his breath. "When the real pressure hits, that's when you see who people really are." The first challenge was a timed beach run followed by a cold water immersion test. Candidates had to complete a 5-mile course through soft sand and then remain functional in 58-degree water for 30 minutes while performing complex tasks. It was designed to eliminate those who relied on pure physical fitness without the mental resilience to function when their bodies wanted to shut down. Thomas started the run at a steady, sustainable pace that drew smirks from several faster candidates who shot past him in the first mile. By mile 3, however, his consistent rhythm began paying dividends. While others struggled with the energy-sapping effects of soft sand and began to falter, Thomas maintained his pace with the mechanical precision of someone who understood the difference between going fast and going the distance. He finished the run in the top third of the group, barely breathing hard, while several younger candidates bent over in exhaustion. But the real test came in the water. As the candidates entered the frigid Atlantic, the shock of the cold temperature caused immediate panic in several of them. The tasks they were required to perform, knot tying, basic math problems, equipment assembly, became monumentally difficult as their core temperatures dropped and their fine motor skills deteriorated. Thomas entered the water with the same calm demeanor he brought to everything else, but something was different now. The way he moved through the water, the techniques he used to preserve body heat, the systematic approach he took to each task, it all spoke of someone who had done this before, many times, under conditions far worse than a training exercise. Commander Chen watched from the pier, making notes on her waterproof tablet. She had been observing Thomas since the beginning of the selection process, noting inconsistencies between his background file and his demonstrated capabilities. Now, as she watched him efficiently complete tasks that were causing most candidates to struggle badly, those inconsistencies began to form a clearer picture. "Interesting," she murmured to her chief petty officer, who was also watching the proceedings with professional interest. "Sir," he asked, "Mitchell, watch how he's breathing, how he's managing his energy. That's not something you learn from a manual." In the water, Thomas had become a focal point for the other candidates, though not in the way Johnson had predicted. Instead of folding under pressure, he was demonstrating a level of competence that was making others question everything they thought they knew about him. His movements were economical, purposeful, and most importantly, effective. Foster, the former Army soldier, found himself swimming near Thomas during one of the exercises. "Where'd you learn to do this stuff?" he asked through chattering teeth. Thomas's response was characteristic, minimal but not dismissive. "Experience," he said simply, before moving on to the next task. As the water portion of the test concluded, the candidates emerged shivering and exhausted. Several had been pulled from the water after showing signs of hypothermia, while others had simply given up when the combination of cold and stress became too much to handle. Thomas walked out of the surf looking tired but composed. water streaming from his wetsuit as he moved toward the recovery area with the steady gait of someone for whom this was just another day at the office. The whispered conversations among the remaining candidates took on a different tone that evening. The easy mockery was gone, replaced by a growing awareness that they had fundamentally misunderstood something important about the quiet man with the faded tattoo. But pride dies hard, and rather than admit their error, some doubled down on their original assessment, convinced that Thomas had simply gotten lucky or that the real tests were still to come. What they didn't realize was that for Thomas Mitchell, the real test had begun 15 years ago when he'd made a choice that would define the rest of his life. The final phase of selection took place in a classified facility 30 miles inland from Virginia Beach, where the Navy conducted its most realistic training scenarios. The remaining 22 candidates had survived everything thrown at them so far, but the exercises ahead would separate those who could perform under pressure from those who merely looked the part. Commander Chen gathered the group in a sparse briefing room as dawn broke over the facility. Maps covered the walls, showing terrain that looked suspiciously like locations in various global hotspots. The air conditioning hummed quietly, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Your final exercise begins now," she announced. "You'll be operating in teams of 4, conducting a simulated hostage rescue operation. The scenario is based on real-world events, and you'll be evaluated not just on your physical performance, but on your decision-making under stress, your ability to work as part of a team, and most importantly, your capacity to put the mission above your personal interests." As team assignments were announced, Thomas found himself grouped with Johnson, Stevens, and Foster. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 weeks of mockery and assumptions had led to this moment, where their success would depend entirely on their ability to function as a unit. Johnson, still maintaining his unofficial leadership role, immediately began organizing the team. "All right, here's how we're going to do this. I'll take point, Stevens covers our 6, Foster handles communications, and," he paused, looking at Thomas with barely concealed condescension, "Mitchell, you can carry extra equipment." Thomas simply nodded, accepting the assignment without argument. He had learned long ago that proving yourself through words was far less effective than proving yourself through actions, and the next few hours would provide plenty of opportunities for the latter. The scenario unfolded in a mock village constructed to replicate Middle Eastern architecture. The hostages were role players who would react realistically to the team's actions, while opposing forces, played by experienced instructors, would test every aspect of their tactical knowledge and execution. As the team moved through the village, Thomas's behavior began to puzzle his teammates. While Johnson called out commands and made tactical decisions, Thomas seemed to be operating on a different level entirely. He anticipated problems before they developed, positioned himself in ways that maximized the team's effectiveness, and demonstrated situational awareness that bordered on supernatural. When they encountered their first opposition, Thomas's response was immediate and precise. While the others were still processing the threat, he had already identified cover positions, escape routes, and tactical advantages. His movements were fluid and professional, lacking the hesitation that marked even the most confident of the other candidates. "How did you know they'd be there?" Stevens asked in amazement after Thomas had guided them around what would have been a devastating ambush. "Experience," Thomas replied again, the same word he'd used in the water, but now it carried different weight. The climax of the exercise came when they reached the building where the hostages were being held. The structure was a perfect replica of a compound that had been the site of numerous real-world operations, and the tactical challenges it presented were formidable. Johnson's plan was aggressive but flawed, calling for a direct assault that would likely result in casualties among both the team and the hostages. As he began to brief the approach, Thomas quietly spoke up for the first time during the entire exercise. "That won't work," he said simply. "What?" Johnson's voice carried both surprise and irritation. "The approach you're describing. I've seen it tried before. It doesn't work. There was something in Thomas's tone that made everyone stop and look at him. Not the voice of someone offering an opinion, but someone stating a fact based on personal knowledge. "What do you mean you've seen it tried before?" Foster asked. Thomas looked at each of them for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything they thought they knew about him. "Because I was there," he said quietly. "Tikrit 2004. Compound just like this one. We lost 2 good men because someone thought a frontal assault was the answer to every problem." The silence that followed was deafening. Johnson's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning comprehension. "You were," Stevens began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas rolled up his sleeve completely, revealing the full extent of his tattoo. What they had seen as a faded anchor was actually something far more significant: a sealed trident, the symbol earned by fewer than 1% of those who attempt the training. Below it were dates and coordinates that told the story of multiple deployments and operations that would never be fully declassified. 22 years, Thomas said simply. "Retired as a senior chief. The compound you're looking at. I helped design this training facility." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Everything they had assumed, every joke they had made, every moment of condescension, all of it crumbled in the face of this truth. Thomas Mitchell wasn't some delusional janitor trying to reclaim lost glory. He was exactly what his faded tattoo proclaimed him to be. The aftermath of Thomas's revelation transformed everything about the team's dynamic, and more broadly, the entire selection process. Word spread quickly through the remaining candidates that the quiet man they'd been mocking was not only a decorated Navy SEAL, but one whose service record included some of the most dangerous and classified operations of the early 2000s. As they completed the hostage rescue exercise using Thomas's tactical recommendations, which proved flawlessly effective, Johnson found himself grappling with a shame so profound it was almost physical. Every joke, every snide comment, every moment of casual disrespect now felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. "Senior Chief," he said quietly as they regrouped after the successful completion of their mission. The formal address felt strange on his tongue, but somehow necessary. "I owe you an apology, we all do." Thomas looked at the young man for a long moment. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction at having proven his detractors wrong. Instead, there was something that looked almost like understanding. "You don't owe me anything, son," he said quietly. "You made assumptions based on incomplete information. It happens to everyone." But Johnson wasn't willing to let himself off that easily. "No, sir, it was more than that. We were." He struggled to find words adequate to express the depth of his regret. "We were everything wrong with the military, everything wrong with people." Commander Chen had been observing the interaction from a distance, and now she approached the group. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her bearing that suggested significant developments were ahead. "Senior Chief Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the respect that his rank and service record demanded. "A word, if you please." They walked away from the group, leaving the other candidates to process what they had learned. Foster was shaking his head in disbelief, while Stevens kept staring at the training facility as if seeing it for the first time, which, in a sense, he was. "Sir," Commander Chen began once they were out of earshot, "I've been reviewing your file more carefully. Your decision to return to service at your age, given your background, it's unusual." Thomas nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I imagine it is. Your record shows you were awarded the Navy Cross for actions in Fallujah. 3 bronze stars with combat distinguishing devices, a silver star. You completed 6 combat deployments and served as a senior instructor at the most advanced levels of SEAL training." She paused, studying his face. "Why are you here, Senior Chief? Why subject yourself to this process when you could walk into any Special Operations Command and write your own ticket?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the training facility he had helped design during his final years of active duty. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 15 years of civilian life and the complex emotions that had driven him back to service. After I retired, I thought I was done. Took a job as a janitor because I wanted something simple, something that didn't require life-or-death decisions every day. He turned to face her directly, but September 11th changed something for a lot of us. And when the war started ramping up again, when I saw young men and women deploying to places I knew, facing challenges I understood, I couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. Commander Chen nodded slowly. And the selection process. These recruits need to understand what they're signing up for. They need to see that heroism doesn't always look like what they expect. Sometimes it looks like a 52-year-old janitor who's willing to put his comfortable retirement on hold because his country needs him. As they rejoined the group, the dynamic had shifted completely. The remaining candidates stood at attention, not because they'd been ordered to, but because they instinctively recognized that they were in the presence of someone whose service embodied everything they hoped to achieve. Commander Chen addressed the group. Candidates, you've just completed one of the most important lessons in military service. Senior Chief Mitchell has spent the last 15 years in civilian life, working as a high school janitor. He returned to service, not because he needed to prove anything to himself or to you, but because he believed his experience could make a difference in preparing the next generation of special operations personnel. She paused, letting the implications sink in. That faded tattoo you've been mocking represents more courage than all of you combined will ever possess. It represents sacrifice, dedication, and a willingness to serve something greater than oneself that doesn't diminish with age or occupation. Johnson stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Senior Chief, permission to formally apologize to the team for my conduct. Thomas looked at the young man, seeing not the cocky recruit who had led the mockery, but a future leader who was learning one of the hardest lessons military service had to teach. Humility in the face of true heroism. Apology accepted, Johnson, but more importantly, lesson learned. The person standing next to you in formation, the one you think you can dismiss because of their age, their background, or their appearance, they might be the one who saves your life when everything goes wrong. As the selection process concluded over the following day,